So, Donald Trump just called out Canada. Not Mark Carney, not the Canadian government, not a specific policy or a specific trade grievance or a specific diplomatic dispute. Canada, the country, the people, the nation itself, dismissed in a single statement from the White House briefing room as a failed state riding on America's back. A country that wouldn't last 6 months without American protection and American trade. A country whose citizens should be embarrassed by the leadership they keep choosing. A sitting American president just attacked the national identity of 38 million people, questioned the viability of an allied nation, and insulted an entire electorate for the crime of choosing leaders he doesn't like. And Mark Carney, the prime minister, whose measured, calculated, meticulously timed responses have defined 18 months of confrontation, fired back within 90 minutes. Not 90 days, not 90 hours, 90 minutes. The fastest retaliatory response in the history of the USC-Canada relationship, delivered with a speed that told the world this wasn't a reaction. It was a detonation protocol. A preloaded response activated the moment Trump crossed the one line that Carney had been waiting for him to cross. Within those 90 minutes, Canada announced the immediate cancellation of 12 bilateral agreements covering military procurement, agricultural trade, water sharing rights, and cross-border infrastructure. Canada imposed a 200% tariff on every category of American agricultural export entering the Canadian market. Effective at midnight, no phase-in period, no exemptions. Canada formally invoked the Democratic Sovereignty Compact, triggering consultations with 17 allied nations on collective economic sanctions against the United States. And Carney delivered a televised address to the nation that was carried live by networks in 41 countries and that contained a single sentence so devastating in its simplicity that it broke the internet's own records for the fastest trending phrase in the history of the platform. Said Trump just triggered the one response that cannot be managed, cannot be negotiated, and cannot be reversed, because attacking a country's identity doesn't produce a policy dispute, it produces a war of principle, and wars of principle don't end at the negotiating table. But it's what Carney said, 9 words delivered 90 minutes after Trump's statement, standing in front of a Canadian flag with 38 million citizens watching, that will outlast this crisis, this presidency, and this era. When you hear what Trump specifically said about Canada, why Carney's response came so fast, what the 90-minute timeline reveals about how prepared Canada was for this exact scenario, what the 12 canceled agreements mean for American military and agricultural interests, and what Buffett explains about the difference between attacking someone's interests and attacking their identity, you'll understand why this isn't another round of the trade war. This is the round that ended the relationship. Hit subscribe because the compact consultation with 17 nations begins tomorrow, and what comes out of that consultation will reshape the Western alliance for a generation. Let me take you through exactly what Trump said, because the language matters. Not just the words he chose, but the target he chose and why targeting a country's identity rather than its leader or its policies represents a fundamentally different kind of provocation that produces a fundamentally different kind of response. Trump's statement was delivered during a scheduled press briefing in response to a reporter's question about the status of U.S.-Canada trade negotiations. The question was routine. The answer was not. Trump spoke for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and in those 4 minutes, he did not attack Mark Carney, he did not criticize a specific Canadian policy, and he did not reference a specific trade grievance. He attacked Canada itself, the country, the concept, the national project. His exact words included, "Canada is a failed state riding on America's back. They don't have a military. They don't have an economy without us. They don't have relevance without us. They sit up there above us on the map, collecting the benefits of being America's neighbor while contributing absolutely nothing to the partnership." He continued, "The Canadian people should be embarrassed. They should be embarrassed by the leaders they keep choosing, by the decisions those leaders keep making, and by the fact that their country, their entire country, only exists because the United States allows it to exist. Without us, Canada is a frozen parking lot with a flag," he added. And I think most Canadians know that. I think most Canadians in their hearts know that their country is a junior partner that got too big for its britches, and that everything they have, everything is a gift from the American people that can be taken back whenever we decide. The language was revealing in a way that previous provocations were not. Previous attacks targeted Carney, his leadership, his policies, his legitimacy. Those were attacks on a political figure, and political figures can be defended, criticized, and replaced within the normal mechanics of democratic politics. This targeted Canada, not the government, but the country, not the leader, but the people, not a policy, but a national identity. A failed state, a frozen parking lot with a flag. Everything they have is a gift from the American people. The language was designed, whether consciously or through the instinct of a man who has spent decades understanding which words inflict maximum damage, to humiliate not a leader but a nation, to make 38 million people feel small, to reduce 159 years of national history, democratic development, institutional achievement, and cultural identity to the status of an American dependency that exists at American pleasure. International reaction was immediate, and it was categorically different from the response to any previous provocation because the target was different. When Trump attacked Carney, allied governments defended Carney. When Trump attacked Canadian trade policy, allied governments criticized the tariffs. When Trump attacked Canadian sovereignty, allied governments condemned the interference. But when Trump attacked Canada itself, the country, the people, the national project, allied governments reacted with something closer to horror. Because every government recognized instantly that if the United States could dismiss an allied nation as a failed state and a frozen parking lot with a flag, there was nothing preventing the same language from being directed at them. France's president responded within an hour, calling the statement an insult not to Canada, but to every nation that has ever been told it exists only because a larger nation permits it. Germany's chancellor issued a statement calling the language indistinguishable from the rhetoric historically used by imperial powers to justify the subjugation of smaller nations. Japan's prime minister called it deeply alarming and without precedent in the modern alliance system. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a statement noting that language dehumanizing or delegitimizing entire national populations has historically preceded the most serious violations of international norms. And then 90 minutes after Trump's statement, Carney appeared on national television. The speed was the first signal. Every previous Canadian response in the 18-month confrontation had been measured in days, sometimes weeks. Calculated intervals designed to demonstrate that Canada operated on its own timeline, not America's. 72 hours of deliberation before the energy suspension, 48 hours of silence before the dollar clearing response, 36 hours of preparation before the buyer's confrontation. The intervals were strategic. They communicated patience, discipline, and the refusal to be rushed by provocation. This time, there was no interval. 90 minutes, the fastest response of the entire crisis. And the speed itself was the message. Because a 90-minute response to a 4-minute statement means the response was not drafted in 90 minutes. It was drafted months ago. It was sitting in a folder, complete, reviewed, approved, waiting for the specific trigger that would justify its deployment. The trigger was the attack on Canadian identity, and the folder was opened the moment the words failed state left Trump's mouth. Carney appeared from the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa, standing in front of a single Canadian flag wearing a dark suit, no podium between him and the camera. The setting was stripped of every ceremonial element that had accompanied previous addresses. No parliament, no press gallery, no assembled members, no dignitaries. Just a man, a flag, and a camera. The simplicity was deliberate. This was not a parliamentary performance. This was a prime minister speaking directly to his country and through his country to the world. He began quietly, almost softly. A few hours ago, the President of the United States called Canada a failed state. He called our country a frozen parking lot with a flag. He said, everything we have is a gift from the American people. He said, we exist because the United States allows it. He paused one beat. I want to respond to that. Not with anger, though I feel it. Not with outrage, though it would be justified, but with facts. Because facts are what a failed state doesn't have, and Canada has plenty of them. What followed was 4 minutes of the most surgically precise national defense ever delivered by a head of state on live television. A point-by-point dismantling of every claim in Trump's statement, delivered without notes, without a teleprompter, without a single rhetorical flourish or emotional appeal. Nothing but specific, verified, inarguable facts delivered in the flat, measured tone of a central banker reading a balance sheet. Canada's banking system has been ranked the soundest in the world for 15 consecutive years by the World Economic Forum. The United States has never held that ranking. Canada's healthcare system provides universal coverage to every citizen. 44 million Americans have no health insurance. Canada's homicide rate is 1/4 of the American rate. Canada's life expectancy exceeds America's by 3.4 years. Canada's child poverty rate is lower. Canada's educational outcomes are higher. Canada's infrastructure quality rating is higher. Canada's democratic institutions are rated more trustworthy by every international index that measures institutional integrity. He let each fact land. No commentary, no editorializing, no so there, just data. Each number a brick in a wall that Trump's rhetoric could not climb. And as for the claim that Canada only exists because the United States allows it, let me remind the president, since his understanding of history appears to require remediation, that Canada existed as a self-governing nation for 28 years before the United States entered its First World War, for 69 years before the United States entered its Second, and that Canadian soldiers landed on Juno Beach on June 6, 1944, fighting and dying to liberate a continent that the United States had watched burn for 2 years before joining the effort. Canada does not exist because the United States allows it. Canada exists because Canadians built it, fought for it, bled for it, and will defend it from any threat, including the one currently occupying the Oval Office. Then the measures effective immediately. Canada is canceling 12 bilateral agreements with the United States. He read them. Military procurement agreements governing $3.7 billion in joint defense contracts. Agricultural trade frameworks covering American grain, soybean, and dairy exports to Canadian markets. Water-sharing agreements covering the Great Lakes, the Columbia River, and the St. Lawrence Seaway. Cross-border infrastructure agreements covering 6 major bridge and tunnel crossings between the two countries. Regulatory harmonization agreements covering pharmaceutical approvals, automotive safety standards, and environmental protocols. These agreements were built on the assumption that the United States regarded Canada as a partner. That assumption has been publicly, explicitly, and irreversibly contradicted by the President of the United States. Agreements built on a false assumption have no foundation. We are removing them. Effective at midnight tonight, Canada imposes a 200% tariff on all American agricultural exports entering the Canadian market. All categories, no exemptions, no phase-in period. The number was staggering. 200% American farmers who export to Canada, wheat growers in Montana, dairy producers in Wisconsin, soybean farmers in Iowa, corn growers in Illinois, would see their Canadian market access functionally eliminated overnight. The tariff was not designed to be negotiated down. It was designed to be felt immediately, viscerally, in the communities and the states whose senators and representatives would be answering phone calls from devastated farmers by morning. Effective immediately, Canada formally invokes Article 7 of the Democratic Sovereignty Compact, triggering mandatory consultations with all 17 member nations on the implementation of collective economic sanctions against the United States in response to what the Compact's founding charter defines as hostile delegitimization of a member state's national identity and democratic institutions. The invocation was the first use of the Compact's collective response mechanism, the trigger that transformed 17 individual nations into a coordinated economic bloc, acting in concert against the country that provoked the invocation. The consultations would begin within 48 hours. The sanctions, if agreed upon, would represent the largest coordinated economic action ever directed at the United States by allied democracies. And then the 9 words. Carney stopped reading measures. He stopped citing facts. He stopped speaking in the flat, measured central banker register that had characterized the first 6 minutes of the address. He looked directly into the camera. His expression shifted from analytical to personal, from prime ministerial to human, from the leader delivering policy to the citizen defending his home. And he said quietly, with a weight that made 38 million Canadians feel simultaneously seen and defended, "We are not a parking lot. We are a country." The words were simple, almost too simple. 9 words that a child could understand. 9 words with no strategic complexity, no diplomatic nuance, no economic analysis, no geopolitical positioning. 9 words that did something none of the previous defining quotes in the 18-month confrontation had done. They spoke not to Trump, not to the world, not to the alliance system, not to the markets, but to the Canadian people, to the 38 million citizens who had just been told by the President of the United States that their country was a parking lot. The words were Carney saying, "No, you are not what he said you are. Your country is not what he said it is. You are a country, not a failed state, not a dependency, not a parking lot, a country." With everything that word means: history, sovereignty, identity, dignity, and the right to exist without the approval of any foreign power. The phrase trended globally within 6 minutes, the fastest any phrase has ever reached global trending status. Within an hour, it was being projected onto buildings in Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, Ottawa, Halifax, and Calgary. Within 2 hours, it appeared on handmade signs at spontaneous gatherings outside Canadian embassies in 31 countries. Within a day, it had been printed on T-shirts, bumper stickers, and posters that were selling faster than suppliers could produce them. The simplicity was the power. "I don't work for you" was a statement of political independence. "You mistake silence for agreement" was a statement of strategic revelation. "Capital has no flag" was a statement of economic truth. "We are not a parking lot. We are a country" was a statement of national identity. And identity, as every previous chapter of this confrontation had proven, is the one thing people will defend with everything they have. A response addressed the principle that had been running beneath the surface of the entire 18-month confrontation, and that Trump's attack on Canadian identity had finally brought into the open the principle that separates manageable conflicts from existential ones, negotiable disputes from permanent ruptures, and strategic confrontations from wars of survival. In 70 years of business, Buffett said, "I have watched every kind of conflict between every kind of organization. Conflicts over money, conflicts over territory, conflicts over strategy, over market share, over contracts, over personnel. All of those conflicts, regardless of how intense they become, share one characteristic. They are negotiable. They have a price. There is a number, a concession, a restructuring, a compromise that resolves them, because they are about interests, and interests are fungible. They can be traded, adjusted, compensated, and restructured." He paused. "And then there is the other kind of conflict. The conflict that begins when someone attacks the other side's identity, not their interests, their identity, who they are, what their organization stands for, whether they deserve to exist, whether they have value, whether they are legitimate. That conflict is not negotiable. That conflict has no price, because identity is not an interest. Identity is not fungible. You cannot trade it, you cannot compensate for it, you cannot restructure it. You can only defend it. And people, organizations, companies, nations will defend their identity with a ferocity, a unity, and an endurance that no conflict over interests will ever produce." He applied it with the directness of a man who had watched this principle play out enough times to know that the lesson is always learned too late. Donald Trump spent 18 months attacking Canadian interests, trade interests, energy interests, financial interests, territorial interests, and Canada responded to each attack strategically with counter tariffs, with diversification, with coalition building, with the cold analytical precision of a central banker managing a balance sheet. The responses were effective. They were damaging, but they were calculated. They were measured against the specific interest being attacked and calibrated to inflict proportional pain. That is how nations respond when their interests are at stake. They calculate. He paused. Today, Trump attacked Canadian identity. He called their country a failed state. He called it a parking lot. He said it exists at American pleasure. And Canada's response was not calculated. Canada's response was immediate, 90 minutes, the fastest in the history of the relationship. Canada's response was disproportionate. 12 agreements canceled, 200% tariffs, the compact invoked. And Canada's response was emotional. A prime minister standing in front of a flag, speaking to his people, saying 9 words that had nothing to do with trade policy and everything to do with who they are. Buffett went deeper into the mechanics of what Trump had triggered and why it was irreversible. When you attack someone's interest, you start a negotiation. The negotiation might be long, might be painful, might be expensive, but it is a negotiation. There is a deal to be made. There is a price that resolves it. When you attack someone's identity, when you tell them their country is a parking lot, when you tell them they exist at your pleasure, when you tell them they should be embarrassed by who they are, you don't start a negotiation. You start something that has no deal, no price, no resolution. Because the question is no longer, what do you want? The question is, do you respect who I am? And you have already answered that question publicly, irreversibly, in a way that cannot be retracted, reinterpreted, or apologized away. The answer was no, and every action Canada takes from this moment forward will be driven not by what serves Canadian interests, but by what defends Canadian identity. And identity-driven responses don't have off-ramps. They don't have compromised positions. They don't have price tags. They have only one direction forward. His closing was delivered with the weight of someone who has watched this pattern produce the same outcome in every context in which it has ever occurred: corporate, political, personal, national. The most expensive mistake in any conflict is the one that converts the other side from fighting for their interest to fighting for their identity. Interest can be satisfied. Identity can only be defended. And a nation defending its identity will never, never stop fighting, because stopping means accepting the insult. And no nation, no organization, no person with any self-respect accepts being called a parking lot. He paused one final time. Trump wanted a trade war. He just started something much worse. He started a dignity war. And dignity wars don't end at the negotiating table. They end when the person who threw the insult takes it back, or they don't end at all. The consequences cascaded with the velocity that identity-driven responses always produce. Faster than interest-driven responses, more unified, more emotional, and entirely immune to the economic cost-benefit analysis that normally moderates retaliatory action. The agricultural tariffs hit American farming communities within 72 hours. Canadian grocery chains pulled American products from shelves not because of the tariff, but because Canadian consumers stopped buying them. A spontaneous, unorganized, grassroots boycott that no government coordinated and no government could have stopped. American agricultural exports to Canada, a market worth $23 billion annually, collapsed by 81% in the first week. Not because of the tariff alone, because 38 million people who had been told their country was a parking lot decided individually and simultaneously that they would not buy American products until the insult was retracted. The boycott was not strategic, it was personal. And personal boycotts, unlike strategic ones, don't have exit conditions. They last until the anger fades. And the anger, fed daily by the footage of Trump saying a frozen parking lot with a flag, was not fading. The 12 canceled bilateral agreements created immediate operational crises across multiple dimensions of the American government and economy. The military procurement cancellations affected $3.7 billion in joint defense contracts, specialized Arctic warfare equipment, naval communication systems, and aerospace components manufactured by Canadian firms under agreements that took years to negotiate, and that cannot be replaced by American domestic production on any relevant timeline. The water-sharing agreement cancellations created immediate uncertainty for communities on both sides of the Great Lakes, whose water supply, wastewater management, and hydroelectric generation depend on frameworks that no longer existed. The Cross-Bear Infrastructure Agreement cancellations threw 6 major bridge and tunnel crossings into regulatory limbo, the legal authority governing inspections, maintenance, and traffic management suddenly undefined. The cancellations were not threats, they were not negotiating positions, they were accomplished facts. 12 agreements that no longer existed, 12 frameworks that no longer govern, 12 relationships that no longer function. The Democratic Sovereignty Compact consultation began on schedule 48 hours after Carney's invocation, with representatives from all 17 member nations convening in a virtual session that lasted 11 hours, and that produced a joint preliminary assessment describing Trump's statement as meeting the compact's threshold for hostile delegitimization and recommending that the full council convene within 14 days to vote on collective sanctions. The recommendation was unanimous. 17 nations, not one dissent, not one abstention, not one request for more time or more information or more deliberation. The vote was unanimous because the provocation was unambiguous. A sitting president of the most powerful nation on earth called an allied democracy a failed state and a parking lot. And every nation in the compact understood that if that language was tolerated when directed at Canada, it would eventually be directed at them. American domestic politics fractured with an intensity that reflected the unique nature of the provocation. Attacking Carney divided Americans along partisan lines. Republicans defended the attack. Democrats condemned it. Attacking Canadian trade policy divided Americans along economic lines. Those who benefited from tariffs supported them.
Those who were hurt opposed them. But attacking Canada itself, calling it a failed state, a parking lot, dismissing 38 million people as embarrassments, divided Americans along a line that had nothing to do with partisanship or economics. The line between those who believe America should treat allies with basic respect and
those who believe American power entitles America to say whatever it wants about anyone. That line cut through both parties, through every state, through every demographic. 67% of Americans, in polling conducted within 5 days, said Trump's language about Canada was inappropriate or unacceptable. 41% of Republicans agreed. 14 Republican members of Congress issued statements criticizing the language, not the policy, not the strategy, the language. One Republican senator from a border state, whose constituents include tens of thousands of Canadian Americans with family on both sides of the border, said on the Senate floor, "Canada is not a parking lot. Canada is a country that has fought alongside us in every war, traded with us in good faith for over a century, and shared the longest peaceful border in human history. And the President of the United States owes them and owes us a basic level of respect that his statement did not reflect." So here's where we stand. The President of the United States called Canada a failed state, a frozen parking lot with a flag, a country that exists because America allows it. 90 minutes later, Mark Carney canceled 12 bilateral agreements, imposed 200% tariffs on American agriculture, invoked the Democratic Sovereignty Compact, triggering consultations with 17 allied nations, and stood in front of a Canadian flag and said 9 words that are now on every surface in the country, on buildings, on signs, on shirts, on the lips of 38 million people who heard their country called a parking lot and responded with a single, unified, unshakable answer: "We are not a parking lot. We are a country." Buffett explained why this was different from everything that came before with the clarity of a man who has spent 70 years watching the difference between conflicts that resolve and conflicts that don't.